A fuming man barges into a cafe, pointing an accusing finger at Barron Trump. What follows is an exchange so astonishing, it leaves everyone rethinking their own beliefs. It was a crisp afternoon in downtown Philadelphia, and the rich scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted lazily out of a quaint corner cafe. Inside, the gentle hum of conversations mingled with the soft clinking of spoons against mugs, creating a cozy, welcoming vibe. Barron Trump sat by the window at a small table, his tall frame slightly curved over a thick book. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he looked unremarkable, blending seamlessly with the cafe's regular crowd. That's exactly what he'd hoped for. A rare moment of normalcy. As the youngest son of a former president, his life had often been a whirlwind of cameras, headlines, and judgment. But here, in this small cafe filled with strangers scrolling their phones and sipping cappuccinos, he felt a strange yet comforting sense of invisibility. Engrossed in his book, Barron didn't notice the man at first. The cafe's peaceful rhythm was shattered by a booming voice. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" The accusatory tone pierced the air, silencing every conversation in the room. All heads turned to see a man, likely in his late 40s, standing just feet from Barron's table. His face, lined with years of hardship, burned with an intensity that demanded attention. His clothes, though clean, bore the wear of someone weathered by tough times. Barron blinked, stunned but not afraid. He hadn't anticipated drama when he'd chosen this cafe as a quiet retreat. The atmosphere grew tense, charged with curiosity and unease. "You've had everything handed to you on a silver platter," the man spat, his voice shaking with anger. "Do you even know what it means to struggle?" The other patrons exchanged wary glances, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch. Behind the counter, the barista froze, her hand hovering over the phone. Barron remained composed, a stark contrast to the man's fiery demeanor. Closing his book carefully, he placed it on the table and met the man's gaze. "Sir," he began, his voice measured yet firm, "I'm not sure what's bothering you, but maybe we could talk about it." The man let out a harsh laugh. "Talk?" he sneered. "What could someone like you possibly say that would mean anything to someone like me?" The cafe went deathly quiet, every patron holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. People watched, their breath held tight, wondering what was about to unfold. Yet instead of meeting the man's hostility with equal force, Barron made a move no one anticipated, one that shifted the entire dynamic. Leaning back in his chair, Barron's body language was calm but attentive. The man's rage seemed to radiate across the cafe, setting an uneasy tone that even distant onlookers couldn't ignore. But Barron didn't react the way most would expect. He extended a hand toward the empty chair in front of him. "Please, have a seat," he said, his voice steady and composed. The simple gesture momentarily threw the man off balance, though the anger in his posture didn't waver. The man stood rooted, fists clenched, his glare locked on Barron. A sneer crossed his face. "Why would I sit with someone like you? You're just another rich kid who's never had to deal with the real world." The murmurs of nearby customers grew louder as discomfort rippled through the room. Behind the counter, the barista shifted slightly, as though preparing to step in if needed. But Barron held firm. "You might be right," he replied, his tone even and thoughtful. "I haven't lived your life, but if you take a seat, maybe you can help me understand." His words hung in the air, and for a fleeting moment the man appeared uncertain. There was no provocation in Barron's voice, only an invitation. The man leaned forward, lowering his voice, though it remained laced with contempt. "You think I owe you my story? You think that'll make you feel better about your perfect little life?" he snapped, his sarcasm sharp. Barron's gaze stayed steady. "I believe everyone's story deserves to be told," he answered simply, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. The man hesitated, as though weighing whether to lash out again or consider the unexpected sincerity in Barron's tone. Around them, the cafe seemed to hold its breath. Patrons were still watching, their initial unease now mixed with curiosity and maybe a hint of hope. Whatever was happening, they couldn't tear their eyes away. At last, the man gripped the back of the empty chair and dragged it noisily across the floor. He sank into it with a defensive posture, his arms crossed tightly, his jaw clenched, and his eyes stayed fixed on Barron, as if trying to find a weakness in his calm exterior. "All right," he muttered begrudgingly. "You want to know about the real world? I'll tell you." The cafe seemed to exhale all at once. While the tension wasn't entirely gone, it felt less oppressive. The barista quietly stepped away from the phone. The other customers leaned in slightly, feigning disinterest while hanging on every word. Barron leaned forward just a bit, his expression open and ready. "I'm listening," he said, his voice unwavering. And then the man began to speak. But what followed wasn't just a tale, it was a confession. He inhaled deeply, his shoulders rising as if bracing himself. When he started, his voice was quieter, but the rawness was unmistakable. "You look at me and think I'm angry for no reason," he began, his words biting. "But you don't understand what it's like to lose everything." He scanned the cafe, his eyes daring anyone to cut him off before locking onto Barron. "I had a good job, a family, a life I was proud of. Then the factory closed. Just like that, gone. Hundreds of us left with nothing but empty promises of relocation, promises that never happened. The only sound in the room was the faint hiss of the espresso machine. His voice wavered as he kept going, his tough demeanor breaking apart with every word. I did my best to hold it together for my wife and kids, taking any odd job I could find. But when you're barely making it, it doesn't take much to push you over the edge. My wife..." His voice faltered and his eyes grew glossy. "She left, took the kids, said she couldn't do this anymore." He paused, looking down, his fingers brushing the table's surface as if searching for something solid. "I don't even blame her." Barron stayed silent, his expression unreadable, though his eyes showed nothing but understanding. The man stared at the table, his hand tracing the wood grain absent-mindedly. "Do you know what it's like to walk into a room and feel everyone's eyes on you, judging you, deciding you're nothing before you've even spoken? That's my life, every day." His words hung heavy, and their weight wasn't lost on the others listening. A woman at a nearby table shifted uncomfortably, suddenly focused on her coffee as if trying to process his pain. The man's tone sharpened, his frustration bubbling over. "Then I see someone like you," he said, his voice rising, "sitting here in your fancy clothes, reading a book like life's just fine. It makes me angry because no matter how hard I try, I'll never have what you have." The room was charged with the tension of his words, like a storm waiting to break. Barron didn't rush to respond. He let the silence settle, giving the man's anguish the respect it deserved. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I don't know what it's like to be in your position," Barron said gently, "but I do know what it feels like to be judged, to have people decide who you are before you even get the chance to speak." The man looked up sharply, suspicion etched across his face. What could you possibly know about that? What Barron said next caught everyone off guard, shifting the mood of the cafe in a way no one anticipated. Taking a steady breath, he leaned closer, his calm presence cutting through the tension like a balm. "You might think my life's easy, Because of my name, Barron started, his voice steady but carrying a depth that drew everyone in. And in some ways, you'd be right. I've never had to worry about where I'd sleep or what I'd eat, but that doesn't mean I don't know what it's like to be misunderstood. The man let out a dismissive scoff, ready to interrupt, but Barron raised his hand, not to shut him down, but to quietly ask for a moment to explain. Everywhere I go, people make assumptions about me. They think they know everything, what I believe, what I've done, just because of my last name. They don't see me. They see some version of me they've made up in their heads. And honestly, that's what's happening right now. The man's expression tightened, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. His defensive stance eased, arms uncrossing slightly. Barron's voice softened, but it lost none of its sincerity. I'm not saying my struggles are the same as yours. They're not. But pain doesn't discriminate. Feeling invisible, like no one sees the real you. That's something we've all felt in some way. The cafe was utterly still, the kind of silence that presses down thick with reflection. Even the barista froze mid-step, her tray of cups left balancing precariously in her hand. Barron leaned back slightly in his seat, giving the man room to process the words he had just spoken. I'm not here to argue with you, and I'm not trying to change your mind, he said calmly. I just want to understand, because I think we're all dealing with things no one else can see, and maybe, just maybe, we'd treat each other better if we did. The man's jaw tightened, his face hardening as if he might snap back with anger again. But then, to everyone's surprise, he let out a sharp breath, almost as though releasing a burden he'd been carrying for far too long. You really believe that? He asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with doubt. Barron gave a small nod. I do. And deep down, I think you believe it too. Otherwise, why would you have shared your story with me? The man blinked, his tough exterior softening slightly. He rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes darting around the cafe, as though just realizing how many people were silently observing. A flicker of embarrassment crossed his face, but he returned his gaze to Barron. You're not what I expected, he admitted, his tone less defensive. What happened next wasn't about what Barron said, it was about the man's response. He sank back into his chair, his posture shifting from guarded to reflective. For a long, silent moment, he simply sat there, lost in thought. The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath, wrapped in the stillness of the moment. Finally, the man spoke, his earlier anger gone from his voice. You know, he began, shaking his head, I came in here mad at the world, mad at people like you, people I thought had it all handed to them, but maybe I've been holding on to that anger for too long. Maybe it's not about you at all. Barron let the words hang in the air, giving them the weight they deserved. When he finally responded, his tone was steady. It's easy to blame strangers for our pain, he said. It's harder to face the things that are really hurting us. But today, you did that, and I respect that. The man looked up at Barron, their eyes meeting for a moment that felt unguarded and honest. For the first time, his expression wasn't tinged with resentment, but with a tired kind of gratitude. You're a good kid, he said, grudgingly, as if the admission took effort. I don't say that often. The atmosphere in the cafe shifted, the earlier tension melting into something softer and more connected. The barista allowed herself a small smile as she got back to her work. A couple seated nearby exchanged glances, their expressions reflecting the quiet impact of the scene. And then the man did something unexpected. He reached across the table, his hand extended. Barron hesitated for just a moment before clasping it firmly. I'm sorry, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. for judging you before I even knew you." Barron smiled warmly, his expression genuine. "And I'm sorry if I ever gave you a reason to feel that way." The handshake lingered briefly before the man pulled his hand away and stood, smoothing out his shirt with a touch of awkwardness. Glancing around the cafe, he raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "I think I owe everyone here an apology too. I came in angry, but this kid reminded me that sometimes we just need to listen." A soft round of applause spread through the cafe, not loud or dramatic, but deeply heartfelt. The man nodded, visibly moved, and made his way toward the door. Just before leaving, he paused, turning back to look at Barron. "Thank you," the man said with quiet sincerity, before stepping out the door. What followed might not have been as striking, but it left an impression on everyone in the cafe. As the door swung shut behind him, a collective breath seemed to pass through the room. Conversations gradually restarted, but something was different. A fresh sense of connection filled the air, a subtle acknowledgement among strangers that they'd just witnessed something special. Barron returned to his spot, reopened his book, and sipped his now lukewarm tea. Before he could fully retreat into his thoughts, a woman from a nearby table approached. She looked to be in her mid-60s, with gentle eyes and a warm smile. "Young man," she began softly, "I just want to tell you, what you did was truly inspiring. You didn't have to hear him out, but you did. And I think you reminded all of us that sometimes a little kindness is all it takes to change everything." Barron gave a small nod, his face calm and modest. "Thank you, ma'am. I think deep down we all just want someone to listen," he replied. She smiled and went back to her seat, leaving Barron to his reflections. The atmosphere in the cafe was transformed. People exchanged friendly glances, struck up conversations, and showed small but meaningful acts of kindness, holding doors open, offering smiles, even covering bills for others. By the time Barron walked out, the entire space felt lighter, as if a spark of positivity had spread among everyone there. The man's frustration, Barron's compassion, and the simple power of listening had sparked a ripple effect of warmth and understanding. As Barron strolled down the street, he couldn't help but marvel at how a single moment of empathy could create such a profound shift. He didn't know the man's story. He might never know it. But for those few minutes in the cafe, their connection had changed the mood of the room. Maybe that's all it takes sometimes, he thought. A little bit of understanding to remind us that, at our core, we're all more alike than we think. This story isn't just about Barron or the man he met. It's about all of us. The burdens we carry, the assumptions we make, and the choice to listen instead of react. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to spread kindness today. And if you want to hear more stories like this, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Together, we can create a ripple of understanding, one story at a time.